Hello, everyone. This is Dominic, and coming to you yet again from Los Angeles, California. I'm really excited to present this performance and talk today that is focusing again on the Czech composer Erwin Schulhoff. So, Erwin Schulhoff, I have talked about several times in the past. I had two different performance lectures on him, one being an overview, the second being primarily focusing on his left hand suite number 3. And today I'd like to focus on what is, in my opinion, perhaps his seminal work for the piano. It's his 5 Pittoresken, in other words, 5 pictures. So this piece, Schulhoff is a huge fan of the number 5. Many of his pieces have 5 movements, 5 sections, and again, this is no other. This piece is really striking in the sense that it was dedicated to a close friend of Schulhoff's, George Gross. George Gross was a painter, which might explain why Schulhoff decided to write this piece and call it 5 pictures. So George Gross was an artist and painter born in 1893. Schulhoff was an artist, musician born in 1894. So they were quite close in age and in temperament. Both of them did go through, in different ways, the horrors of World War I in Germany and Europe. Schulhoff actually fought in the war, but George Gross was enlisted, but due to illness, he actually did not fight. But as an artist, he took it upon himself to really try to exemplify, in his opinion, how humanity had basically decayed to become a baseless organism in his art during this time. And both artists, Gross and Schulhoff, went through many periods of expression. And I would say that, again, the Pittoresken, which were written in 1917, they were written right around, again, World War I. These Pittoresken are really fabulous for many reasons. First of all, they're highly experimental. You'll see the third movement is quite special in the sense that it is complete silence. And how a performer chooses to go about interpreting that is something that I will talk a little bit about and share what I personally have decided to do for that movement. But the other movements are a bit more traditional, actually. They are dances, jazzy dances throughout. The first movement is entitled, well, they have no titles, they're ambiguous pictures, but before each movement, Schulhoff says tempo of a foxtrot, tempo of a one-step, tempo of a maxix, tempo of ragtime. So when we see tempo of something, I would say that it's up for interpretation to assume that this movement is related, at least in some part, to this rather famous dance that these composers, such as Schulhoff, and people would have known quite readily back in 1920s and early 1900s. So I think, first of all, I will perform the work for you, and then we'll talk more about each dance and what makes it so special. Because again, this piece is based off of dances, but yet the music is still supreme. And I find that sometimes listening to the music with no preconceptions can be quite fascinating. So in 5 movements, the piece begins with a foxtrot, which is a rather robust, well, actually that's up for interpretation. A foxtrot can mean many things to many different people. This type of dance was rather ambiguous, to be blunt. It's simply a dance that's in 4/4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it could be many different tempos, which I will get into more. But in Schulhoff's case, this foxtrot is, I would say, a robust one, and it's a rather energetic opening. Then we have a second movement entitled Tempo of Ragtime. This is Schulhoff's interpretation of ragtime. Certainly, ragtime for many Americans and many people in the world means Scott Joplin. So that's The Entertainer, a rather famous piece that Scott Joplin wrote, and one that many people, including myself, associate with ragtime, but I find the second movement to be really special because Schulhoff has his own take on what perhaps a European, dramatic, Czech-influenced ragtime might be. The third movement is entitled In Futurum, and this is where we have the movement of silence. And I will perform that for you, and we'll talk more about that. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out about anything that I'm talking about. But in this movement, he says the tempo should be timeless. So, zeitlos, timeless. It's very, very ambiguous, and I've really enjoyed interpreting this kind of mind-boggling work, actually, which, again, we will get into. The fourth movement is simply titled Tempo of a One-Step, a rather upbeat and, in Schulhoff's case, quite quirky movement, with some beauty, certainly. But again, Schulhoff has a wonderful, at times, sarcasm and humor, and I would say dry wit that he imbues into his music, where I'll show you some examples later of these dances in the big band versions that people would have danced to. Not of Schulhoff's music, but of the conventional one-step and foxtrot. But in Schulhoff's case, his dances always have a little bit of an edge to them. Perhaps because, again, he's writing this music in one of the most, the times of most turmoil in Europe, World War I. And in America, where many of these dances were done, we were a little bit removed from the horrors of the war, being across the ocean. But George Gross and Erwin Schulhoff both were in the thick of things. The final selection of this work is entitled Tempo of a Maxix, and the Maxix is a very interesting dance. A more common term for it might be samba, or well, it's basically a dance that originated in Argentina, Brazil, South America, and it has a wonderful Latin influence on the music. And again, Schulhoff has just really ingenious ways of approaching harmony, melody, and coloration in this particular work, in my opinion. But I think without further ado, I'll play the 5 movements of the 5 Pittoresken by Erwin Schulhoff. So that is the Five Pittoresken by Schulhoff. Each piece has its own very unique voice, and I would say that it's a lot of fun to play this music, even just with your own hands. It's just such a pleasure to play. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about George Grosz. George Grosz is, again, the painter that this piece was dedicated to. First of all, let me just remind you of who Schulhoff was. This is Schulhoff, as you can see, and this is George Grosz. So both of these gentlemen were at one time or another, they were both involved in what was called the Dada Movement. And this is a movement where they felt that after the extreme horrors of World War I, that art had no place, perhaps, in a world as dark and as chaotic and as violent as what we had. So the Dada movement was basically interpreting art as nonsense in some ways. It was composing music. One interpretation of Dada would be the movement In Futurum that I didn't play it. I interpreted it just now. The piece where basically it's all silence. And let's take a look at the score. So this is the score to the piece in question, Intuitorum. And as we can see, he writes so many markings, and one cannot know whether or not he wants us to interpret them with the utmost seriousness, or if he himself would be in the concert hall giggling as the performer tries to sift out what we should do with this score. We see all kinds of different markings, whether it's exclamation points, we see little commas, we see these are all rests of music, which are silence. And we even see him toward the bottom of the page, we see him taking these rests and actually creating little contours with them, creating shapes going up and down the keyboard, which obviously silence going up and down doesn't necessarily equate to anything. But again, in my interpretation of this piece, I see a bass clef on top, I see a treble clef on bottom. So my inclination is to think that the piece begins with the left hand over the right hand. And in some ways, this piece is, for me, a breather of sorts, where it's sort of an interlude, almost an intermission, you might say, between the to dissect this piece exactly in half. So the performer gets sort of a breath of fresh air. And in fact, Schulhoff even asks the performer to breathe, as we see little. If you look at the fourth measure of this piece, we see a little breath mark above the stave, and this is a marking that in music just basically means, this comma means to breathe. And and again, this piece is just so imbued with ambiguity, I would say. And to interpret this, I decided to breathe when asked. I decided to also try to adhere to the exclamation points, the question marks, and in some ways, it's a little bit of acting, I would say, where in my interpretation of this piece, again, we begin with the hands flip-flopped, and then we're trying to find our way to the fourth movement. In sort of a humorous way, I think many of us, well, pianists, musicians, we may have had those moments on stage where we forget what the next note is. And we're trying to find it. And this is something that oftentimes we see in younger children when they practice quite a bit, and then they get on stage, and then they realize, wait, where's the first note? And for me, in a humorous way, I think of this piece in that way, where I'm trying to find the first note of the fourth movement, the one step. And I finally am able to find it after this page of music. It's both a breather, but also I think that there's a little bit of anxiety in this movement, as these exclamation points, these breath marks, these. Also, notice, I'll go back to the score. Notice the faces that Schulhoff actually writes. If you look at the third stave, or the third line down, we see a smiley face, well, a content face on top, and we see a little frowny face on the bottom stave. And then at the very end of the piece, we see another sort of content face. And for me, I would say that halfway through this movement, we're a little troubled that we're not exactly sure where to go. But we're content that it's okay. And we keep searching. At the end of the piece, when we see these smiley faces, I would say that we're content in knowing that, we finally have found the correct note for the fourth movement. Thank God. So we can continue. And again, actually, the marking, if you can read it, again, the tempo marking says Zeitmaß, Zeitlos, which means tempo is timeless. And then it says, in Italian, it says, tutto il canzone con espressione e sentimento libitum sempre sino al fine, which basically translates to this song with expression and sentiment freely, always, until the end. So again, there's such freedom in this work, and there's so many ways to interpret it. I've seen many, well, not many, because people don't play this piece much, but I've seen a few different versions of this movement. I choose to put the pedal down at the very beginning of the work to try and keep to try and create as much ambiance and just openness. I want to open the piano so that any sounds that might filter in are caught in the strings and vibrate. So I choose to do that, and then in the triple exclamation point martial pause, grand martial pause of the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth line down, we see this really dramatic fermata exclamation point grand martial pause. I choose there to basically quickly send my hands out each way to hit the wood of the piano here and try to make as much of an impact as possible without actually playing the instrument. Because again, I think every pianist and other musicians in different ways, we've all at some point or another frantically tried to find the note and accidentally hit the instrument and created some kind of knocking sound. So in the most dramatic moment, I would say, as I search for the note frantically, I accidentally hit the piano. And that echoes through the chamber of the instrument. So I just wanted to bring some attention to this piece because, again, I see it as both humorous, witty, but at the same time, what Schulhoff always does is he always has seriousness in his music. Even when he's writing Dada music like this, which is, again, nonsense in some ways. What is a silent movement? And look at all the effort he took into writing all these rests, all this ink he wasted on saying, be quiet. I think that even though he's sort of writing nonsense, I think that there's something to be found here. And if audiences find it kind of humorous, witty, so, that's exactly the one interpretation of it. And again, we must remember that the most famous piece of silence ever was John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It was written, John Cage wrote his piece 33 years after this. So again, we see Schulhoff, who is really a forgotten voice. He's writing music, he's creating ideas well before his time, and well before people would recognize him. I mean, I don't think anybody knows this movement particularly well. Maybe some specialists certainly know this piece, but everyone knows John Cage's music, but Schulhoff's not so much, which is unfortunate because for me, I find this movement to be much more fascinating and actually much more open for interpretation, because John Cage's work, as psychologically interesting as it is as exact as it is, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, I find this movement to be really fascinating in the sense that there is no timing to it. In fact, I would say Schulhoff might even challenge us to literally adhere to the tempo marking of timeless. And I think Schulhoff would be curious to see how long a performer can go without playing, and how awkward or how mystical they can create the space. Certainly in a concert hall, when you have a wonderful ambiance, wonderful reverb, and you have an audience perhaps that's making noise, there's so many fascinating things that one can actually listen to and react to. So this piece really is open to so much interpretation, and I'm sure that I will change my impressions of it as time goes on. But just right now, that's just the way that I'm interpreting the piece, and I think it's a work that takes a bit of seriousness, takes a little bit of playfulness, a little bit, and it certainly is a sort of a nice reprieve as one is able to breathe. Our teachers have all told us from young ages that, breathe at the piano, and in a movement like this, we're being told again to breathe, and rightly so. It's something that we should all always remember to do. So now I'd like to talk about George Grosz, and again, a little bit more about him as an artist. Basically, he had many different, again, this is George Grosz. George Grosz had many different experiences throughout art. He painted some really explosive paintings, such as, well, literally one entitled Explosion. In this painting, we see forms of cubism, surrealism. We see basically that this was a response to World War I. This is basically, we see an inferno of images and colors, but it's all rather filled with rage, I would say. And certainly this is supposed to depict Berlin around the time of I guess, right after the World War I, I would say. And we see body parts everywhere. We see just absolute destruction. Another rather interesting piece that he created is one entitled Funeral. Here we see this procession throughout a city landscape. Again, it has a similar feeling and coloristic type hue to it as Explosion, but again, it's supposed to depict just this again, more carnage. Both of these are in response to World War I and are quite vivid and striking indeed. So another work of his that is not as pleasing at all is this work. Now this little sketch actually is depicting a type of art called New Objectivity, and this is what George Grosz and other artists composed in response to the beauty of Impressionism. We all know Monet, we all know the beautiful landscape portraits and paintings of early 1900s, but because of the war, because of just so much of this anxiety and frustration that artists had, they felt that Impressionism was no longer really appealing to their senses. They felt that basically Impressionism was fake. It wasn't real. It was not exactly the way things are. And New Objectivity is about being really objective about things and drawing things exactly as they appear. And in this rather ugly example, that's not drawn ugly, but basically Grosz is, first of all, he was a huge caricature artist. He drew many of caricatures of different Nazi German people that, again, he was vehemently anti-Nazi, and he, until he escaped Germany, he was drawing cartoonish depictions of the Nazis and how ridiculous and how vile he saw them. And here, again, we see this sketch is actually entitled Made in Germany. So, again, I think he's making a statement against his own nation about how perhaps ugly or how complacent people might have gotten during this horrible time. But again, this is George Grosz trying to create just an objectivity that he felt that Impressionism was disconnected from. And in some ways, it's possible to agree with that, considering fighting in World War I, being on the front lines. Schulhoff was someone that, again, was a soldier in World War I. He was a POW. He fought on the Russian front. He was a prisoner in Italy. He suffered quite a bit and saw true horror. So Schulhoff was really attracted to this New Objectivity. Schulhoff is interesting because, again, he was born in 1894. So he was born right around the end of great composers such as Brahms, the end of Brahms' life. And Schulhoff studied with Debussy, the beauty of Impressionism. We see beautiful Impressionism in his left-hand suite. We see just beautiful harmonies in Schulhoff's left-hand suite. So we see that Schulhoff is not against writing beautiful music. He's not against Impressionism altogether, but I think that this New Objectivity really fascinated him. And in some ways, I see that a bit in his Pittoresken. For example, let me show you now some of the dances that, and some of the music that would go to some of these dances in a more pop culture sense. To explain, let me show you what a foxtrot would have sounded and looked like in a conventional ballroom. A foxtrot is, simply put, again, a dance in 4/4 time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not swung, actually. Depending on how you interpret it, it's not necessarily swung like a ragtime. For example, so the foxtrot of the Pittoresken. So I don't interpret it like. that swing way because Schulhoff's very, very precise when he wants this rhythm, and when he wants, he knows how to write the correct marking. So the Foxtrot is more of a straight dance, and again, it's a very simple one. So let's take a look at it.
Why did you leave me lonely? 'Cause here's a heart that's only for nobody but you. I'm burning like a flame, dear. I'll never be the same.
So that's an example of, again, a typical big band vocal type of foxtrot that people would have danced to. It's very pleasing indeed. I find that the foxtrot that Schulhoff writes right here is probably the most conventional work. The harmonies are quite, I would say, quite conventional in many ways. They're certainly beautiful, but he's not as experimental, I would say, in this particular movement, the first movement. Now, the second movement is really interesting because he calls it tempo of a ragtime. And a ragtime can mean so many things. A ragtime is a type of dance, and some people would say that, oh, this foxtrot that you just saw, that's a ragtime foxtrot, or it's just a foxtrot, or it's a one-step foxtrot. There's many different ways to really classify ragtime. It's such a broad term. Again, you know, we have Scott Joplin who writes The Entertainer. So, again, the ragtime means many things, but in this light with Schulhoff, I think he's writing a ragtime from a European sense, but also an impressionistic sense. This is really interesting because as much as he admired New Objectivity, in this ragtime, I really see so many parallels to Debussy. I mean, the left hand, for example. All these parallel chords, they're very... This is a very impressionistic type scene, and even when we get harmonies like, it's gorgeous, but this is a watercolor scene in my eyes. And so this is an amalgamation of a ragtime type rhythm and with impressionism. So I think it's definitely a multi-stylistic movement, and it's just really one of his most gorgeous. He did study with Claude Debussy, the very famous composer Claude Debussy. They did not get along though. Debussy was a little too strict, and Schulhoff was wanting more freedom to express himself. But again, we see that he admired Debussy quite a bit. I already talked about In Futurum, which is again the third movement, the movement of silence. But let's take a look now at what people would call a one-step. Let's take a look at this dance. That's the fourth movement, one-step. So the one step, again, is slightly more upbeat, although it's open for interpretation. Basically, the foxtrot is, okay, so ragtime is a very, very broad term. It's up here. Beneath that is a foxtrot, a 4/4 type dance that can be many different things. Beneath that would be a one-step, a two-step. You can do a foxtrot in a one-step. You can do a foxtrot in a two-step. Again, it's a very simple type of walking dance that was very readily accessible to the ordinary person. It was not super complicated. So a one-step basically is a foxtrot, but with a bit more specificity on how the feet move. One step is just an even more simple version versus a two-step. But here we start seeing a bit more of a new objectivity, because we see Schulhoff imbuing more, I would say, unpleasant harmonies, or at least more like wrong notes, perhaps. I would say that the opening, for example, we have these really interesting harmonies. Wow, it's kind of quirky. So I would say that sometimes when I play this piece, I actually do think about how, sure, when we listen to recordings, we hear some really nice sounding big bands, but I'm sure that dancing in the halls, dancing in the bars, a lot of these musicians might be sight reading, and they might not always be playing all the right notes. So sometimes I imagine that this opening, might be some musicians are like, oh, what are the notes? And they kind of mush them a little bit, and it's a little bit dirty, but still the rhythm's there, and people dance and they have a good time. So for me, this one step has a little bit more objectivity to it, where perhaps he's imbuing some of these more slightly dirtier harmonies to try and get a little bit more realism for how a big band actually sounds versus a commercial CD, which has been perfected and just edited. But here we see all kinds of so we see all kinds of kind of shocking, kind of jarring moments, and I can imagine, for me at least, I imagine that perhaps despite the rhythm being pretty steady, I can imagine the big band in this case kind of scrambling and accidentally coming in wrong sometimes, where these abrupt moments and kind of again, quirky harmonies are really, I think, kind of humorous actually. But finally, I'd like to talk about the last movement, the Mexiques, which is again a Latin American type dance, more commonly called the samba. But let's take a look at the Mexiques. again, this is quite a characterful dance, I would say. And sure enough, Schulhoff really imbues his Mexiques with a wonderful mysteriousness in some ways. Whether it's, it begins with sort of an outburst, so we're kind of in this wonderfully uncertain music that is just really just lilting back and forth. So, with all of these wonderfully edgy rhythms and twists and turns of the music, Schulhoff is, I think, really capturing again. Every time he writes a dance for me, and I listen to a conventional Mexique, a conventional Foxtrot, whatever, I always find that Schulhoff is able to really capture almost a really unique voice for each particular dance. And again, there's so many different types of foxtrots and interpretations of it. Just to quickly give you an example, in this piece we have so we have this rather robust foxtrot. We also have other foxtrots where they're both foxtrots, but they're very different types of moods, and this is really important to understand that how broad the foxtrot really is. But I digress. Getting back to the Mexiques, we see yet again, to get very, very technical with the audience, we see more influences of Debussy in this piece. Debussy was a composer who composed his own types of scales. What do I mean by that? Well, we have C major. We have all kinds of major, minor scales, which are very conventional. We hear it in all music. But then Debussy was someone who started composing what he calls a whole tone scale, and it creates wonderful effects. Feels like we're in the clouds or we're in Wonderland or something. It's very mystical. And actually, in the middle section, which is so magical of this Mexiques, it's almost exclusively the whole tone scale being used in the right hand, and we have a wonderful sort of motive in the left hand. So, sorry, sometimes when I'm playing this part, it's just so magical, mystical, and it's really hypnotic in some ways, I would say. So, but again, all of these, to get very, very technical, this is explicitly out of Impressionism's handbook on how to write music, and this is Debussy, textbook Debussy language. Again, we see Schulhoff being a wonderful juxtaposition of so many different sources of music, style, and again, one of my favorite quotes of Schulhoff's is that he would say that if one wants to hear true music, you should go to bars and listen to jazz music, not the concert halls. So this was something that he felt strongly about, because I guess he felt that spontaneity and that freedom that one hears, again, with improvisation, with jazz, is something that was, in his eyes, missing from, I guess, traditional classical music. And we see constantly in Schulhoff's music that he's trying to break down these barriers of jazz and classical. We kind of see him trying to just write music and not be pigeonholed into one or the other. Yes, I would say that again, the Pittoresken, the five Pittoresken, could be, I could talk even more about them, but I think we're wrapping up the hour now, and I just wanted to share this really special piece with you by the really unique and unfortunately lesser known composer Erwin Schulhoff. So that concludes my presentation on the five Pittoresken by Schulhoff. I'd like to thank InPulse Creatives, Alex and Cindy, as always, for hosting these Close Encounter series. It's really a unique platform for artists like myself and others to be able to share our music in a very intimate way with you. And I'm looking forward to a few more live streams this month on the Close Encounter series. So stay tuned, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.